Only thing worse than the talk after lunch is the talk just before the happy hours.
Nobody wants to go to war.
So we spent a fair amount of time this morning sort of talking about defining who you are and what kind of investor that therefore means that you should be aiming towards. So the pitch deck is just a continuation of that, because your pitch deck should match up with the report card that we talked about this morning of what each venture fund or other type of investor is looking for. And where it doesn't match up or doesn't address, which is the more common thing, it's an inhibitory barrier to that fund or whatever wanting to make a meeting. So the most important part of the pitch deck is to know your audience. Who am I sending this to? And that's not just the exercise that we did this morning on, is this an appropriate investor for the kind of business that I'm building? But also, who specifically am I sending it to? What's their level of sort of knowledge about the space? What is it that they're more likely to be interested in? So pitch decks, now, and I'll actually make the point here. So you notice how on a lot of these slides, I've got these little visual cartoons and things. Did that this morning. That's because this is a talk. And so what I want to avoid is throwing up a slide, turning and reading it off to you. So I put something up there that kind of draws the eye, gives it a little visual interest. I can still talk, I can read off the slide, and it doesn't feel as wonky. When you send a pitch deck to somebody, it is designed to be read. So you don't want a lot of that kind of stuff. There must be some, training session out there now on pitch decks that says, keep it simple, stupid, and hits them with cartoons and things. Because I get lots of pitch decks now that a single slide is one cartoon of the guy with a light bulb going on in their head. It just, don't waste slides. So remember, pitch decks are going to be read. They'll probably only get one read. And that may be the only chance you get. So you need to take advantage of that by giving as much information as you can. The other thing that I see that's increasingly irritating, the investment bankers are bad at this, is the idea of the pitch deck as a teaser. It'll get somebody interested and then they'll want to know more. Don't create work. So for every, at Sante, for every deal we do, we've looked at, I think the last ratio is 130 decks. So I don't lack for stuff to look at for pitch decks. Don't create work. Don't have embedded links for more information. Go here, watch this video, download my deck, my non-confidential deck from this site, where the first screen that pops up wants me to enter my email address, personal information. I just, why create work? The pitch deck needs to present your best case, and it needs to be able to do it on its own, not with you having to explain it. So the pitch deck should include an introduction to the company. We'll go into each of these in a little more detail. The introduction to the company, a description of the problem that you're going to address, how you will solve that, what evidence that you have that your technology will solve that, how you go forward, and what you need, and what you'll do with it. And then also why we should trust you to carry this out. Let's take these more. So the introduction to the company is kind of when and how and where it started. The reason to do this is to set the expectations for the rest of the day. So if you're a brand new academic startup with the academic founder running it, I'm going to have a certain set of, I'll cut you some slack on some of the rest of the deck if it's maybe doesn't address some of the issues, because I realize that's where you're coming from. If you're 4 years in and have already built the team and are now making a pitch for where you'll go from here, I'm not going to cut you as much slack if you're not really clear on some of those things like that. So you want to set the expectations of where in the life cycle you are. What problem is it you're addressing? It's usually going to be a clinical problem for this group. Don't just describe it enough to sort of set what the problem is. If they're interested, it's a balancing act here. It should be fairly obvious it's a problem. If you're having to convince people that no, really, there's a problem here, then you need to rethink. You also need to sort of lay out where in the spectrum of therapy you envision this is going to be. But I wouldn't spend slide after slide on this. If you're sending it to a fairly sophisticated life science investor, they already know breast cancer is a bad disease. So you really have to know your audience. Description of the technology, the background, science, what your mechanism of action is, some literature support, key research findings, what intellectual property that you've got. It is better to be clear on what your technology is without going into 40 slides of gels and blots that support each and every tiny piece of this. Give them sort of the summary of the evidence that you've got. They can dive in later if they're interested, but don't oversimplify it. Don't have some cartoon slide that says, the problem is this, our solution, arrow, rainbows and ponies on the other side. I mean, don't tell them what it is that you're actually doing, the mechanism of action by which this works, and what evidence that you have for this. This should probably be the meatiest part of your deck. I said don't do 40 slides, but do 5, 6, however many it takes to actually describe this, because this is what they're really going to decide whether or not it's gained their interest or not, work out the others. So this is probably the major portion of the deck. What preclinical data do you have, or if you're a device, do you have a prototype? This goes back to the business about the introduction. Where are you in the last stage of the company? If you're an academic founder and you want to commercialize this discovery you've made, then you probably need to spend a fair amount of time giving me the data that supports that the discovery you've made actually is biologically true and relevant. You can be a little fuzzier, and in fact, it's probably a mistake to start giving them firm ideas on how you would develop it, because that may not be the best path forward for a capital efficient or from the timeline viewpoint. So if you've introduced yourself as an academic, then they're expecting you to play to that strength and give you the data. If you've introduced yourself as a little more mature company where the technology has kind of been vetted a bit, but here's how I'm going to develop it, then you would spend less time on this and more on what's the path forward look like. These are just weightings. You still have to hit them all, but in terms of the emphasis, I still get decks in where the company is, they're in the clinic, we've got data coming that'll say whether or not this works or not, and they're still pounding away at preclinical data. And then what does the path forward look like? That loops back a little bit to what we talked about this morning about what kind of business am I? So if I'm developing a drug, the path forward to get to the end is FDA approval. Maybe that I get acquired before that when I show efficacy. So this is where you talk about milestones and inflection points. If I'm a device, I oftentimes not only have to have approval, but I've got to have some early sales and adoption. So that's going to be the thing that I'm pointing toward. If I'm tech, I sure have to show that. Sales and adoption and ramping sales. So define what it is that you're trying to get to. You don't have to get to it all on this financing, but you do have to have a clear vision. It's not just we'll keep churning forward. So I know what the end result looks like and what the exit looks like. And so then you then match up to the performance metrics of the investor. And you can do that. You can signal that in the pitch deck. If you're having trouble doing that, you're probably talking to the wrong investor. The ask. I'm astonished how many decks I get that just want to talk about the science. And let's not muddy the conversation with talk of money. So they never tell me how much they want to raise or what it'll be used for. And I know what they're thinking. I'll get you so hooked on the science, you won't care how much I'm asking for. That never works. So the size of the raise and the capital profile of the deal is going to screen out a lot of funds. So why waste their time? That's what they're thinking. Now you may be thinking, well, I want to work with them. Okay, you can say, here's our raise, here's what it's for. There is an alternative strategy where there would be a smaller raise. Some funds actually want you to do the bigger raise. I mean, if you're a $600 million venture fund, you're not interested in writing a $2 million check. It's as much work as the $20 million check. So why not go to them? It needs to be pretty soon in the deck, I think. That's just personal preference. Not a whole bunch of slides and then at the very end they say how much they're going to ask for. And the reason why is, number one, it lets me realize right away if this is going to be a deal I can do or not. Number two, it then gives me something else to evaluate the rest of the deck on. So if you come in and say, I'm raising 17 million, then as I read the deck, I'm saying, okay, 17 million, how are they envisioning that what are they going to do with that? How are they envisioning, which means where are they now and what do they need to get to? I'm already started, I'm playing the game. I'm thinking along with you about how you're going to do that. If you say I'm going to raise 170 million, I'm thinking, oh my God, what's it going to do with all that money? And that influences how I read about the rest of the deck. Maybe it makes the case that it really needs that. But you want the deck to make the case that justifies why you're asking for this amount of money. And that's what I tell them up front so that they can judge for themselves.
Can I ask a question about that real quick?
Yep.
So in your perspective, would you want that money be tied to a de-risking milestone? Or
Can't say you're risking.
Okay, so, or do you want it to an inflection point? I mean, where are you?
It's to an inflection point.
To an inflection point. So you want to get all the way to something that actually.
Yeah, it doesn't do me any good just to get to a milestone.
Okay.
You just need more capital.
Right, you
Yeah.
do, you get past that. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I mean, tranche investment in milestones, but and that segues nicely into, so you've given them the ask, and now you got to tell them why you need that amount of money and where it's going to get you. and you tie it to the milestones and inflection points. So with this capital, we will tick off these activities, which are milestones, at the end of which we will be at what we think is an inflection point. And that's where the judgment comes in. Your idea of an inflection point may not be investor's idea. They're informed by a fair amount of experience about what you get paid for and what you don't get paid for. And realistic timelines. Remember, they're going to automatically double the timeline anyway. And so sometimes people say, well, I'll keep it short. And then when they double it, that'll be the right answer. Don't make a mental correction if it looks like you actually know what you're talking about. They'll trust your timeline more than if it just looks like you're hopelessly naive. So you really need to be realistic here so that they have and you know, the best cases, I've been in pitch sessions where the investor says, you know, I think you could speed that up a little. Now, how would I do that? Well, you do this and this and that. Oh, that's good. Now they're working with you on that. But if they're there with their arms crossed, it'll take longer than that. And you're sort of swimming upstream a bit. I'll also say in terms of today's environment, the timelines really need to be lengthened because, you know, during the pandemic, CROs all had to cut back. So they couldn't fully staff because they couldn't bring everybody in. The animal colonies died back a lot. It got really slow. Then, as we lifted restrictions, we brought all the staff back. We're starting to grow the animal colonies up. All those companies that raised a bunch of money during the bubble have now placed their order for their R&D enabling studies. So there's a backlog there. And some of our companies are having to reserve a slot a year out, some of those studies. So don't throw up a timeline that says, we will make this discovery and then we'll do our GLP talks the next month. It's not going to work. And it won't be believed. This is really one of the most important slides that you can have in the deck. Other than what you're going to do and where the money lays on top of that. So what the investor will do, and you need to be doing it too, is figuring out, okay, if that's delayed, what does that do to that? What does it do to that? And when do they run out of money? And are we going to run out of money and need to raise more capital before we've gotten to the inflection point? So, and don't assume that great things are going to happen that will make raising money easier. The most common mistake is, I will raise the amount of capital necessary to get me into the clinic and have a couple of patients on, and then they'll respond. And then I'll raise the money to do the rest of the trial. That doesn't work. And in fact, when I was a clinical investigator, one of the questions I asked the companies was, do you not have enough funding to do the entire trial? The answer was no. I'm going to raise the money in the middle of the trial. I wouldn't do the trial. It's not ethical. Have people start and then run out of cash. And then finally, the team. So a brief description of each person and what their responsibilities and the experience that qualifies them for that. Personal preference, I don't like the slides that have management team and then this sort of a bunch of bubbles of different pharmaceutical logos over here and over 100 years collectively of experience. What I need to know is what's each person's experience. Well, I don't have to be, 40 years of doing this. I just need to know that they know that they've got relevant experience. They've seen it done and helped do it in the past. It's just startups. Everybody's not going to be a senior executive. It's okay to have slots that are to be filled. That can be part of your use of proceeds. Have a realistic idea of what it will take to fill that slot and any impact on your timelines. So If you're still in your IND enabling studies and you need to hire a chief medical officer, that's fine. That date of hire needs to be before day one of the trial, though. I mean, they should have a say in the enabling studies as well, as if there's something peculiar that needs to be designed, but it doesn't have to be filled as of today. Now, I talked about it this morning. Imagine the worst experience you've had with a salesman. Don't reproduce that from the other end. Don't make work. Don't try and tease them. Don't use hype. Don't do cartoons. Just remember it. It's going to be read, and it should present a case for you. So now you've made your deck. I'll take a bunch of questions about specific parts of the deck. So now what do you do with it? So the logistics and protocol for sending decks is you have a cover letter email that briefly describes the opportunity and what it is that you're presenting to them. It's helpful if you sort of highlight in that cover letter things that you know would be sort of fill out their report card. We're raising our first round of institutional financing. We're looking for a lead investor. We are doing this. We know that your network and experience would be a real value add. If your LP base or the experience of the people in the fund. Make the case why you're asking for more than just a check from them. And then give them time. We get 100 decks. They all get entered and logged and then assigned to people. So cover letters and astonishing. I mean, again, investment bankers are the worst at this. Sending you this deck, marvelous opportunity. The management is free on Tuesday afternoon for a call to discuss. I actually get cover letters like that, you know. It just makes you sound naive. If you haven't heard back in like a month or so, it's okay to drop a little note, say just following up. You know, I would keep it pretty simple and pretty low key. So when you're, you know, if the fund is gearing up for their annual meeting or they're dealing with a crisis in one of their portfolio companies, the person that they're pitching or whatever, don't make it easy for them to say, hey, well, I'm going to get this off my desk. I'll pass. So you looking like you demand work from them just makes it easy for them to pass. We try and send a reply of some sort to everybody that submits to us, so they at least know we got it. We look at every deck. I don't swear that every fund does, but we do. We look at every deck. So it goes through our processes. It comes in, gets logged in the system. We have somebody who's had some training sort of go through it. I mean, they get rid of the ones that are pitch decks for Burger King franchises and things like that. But the others get into the system, tagged, signed. That's actually, they go to one of our analysts who then assigns it to one of the investment professionals, one of the partners. They all get looked at by somebody, you know, who's a real person in the fund. It does take some time, and we will rapidly. And if we think there might be interest, you know, we have a new deal meeting. We'll bring it up, see if other people share that interest, and then that may lead to then a request for a meeting. You can't assume that you're going to get a meeting. So if you're sending out decks that say, I'll follow up and explain all this to them. The deck is going to have to make your pitch, and it may take a while. In terms of then, okay, you scored a meeting. Now what? Again, for the ultimate time, do your homework. Who are you talking to? You are going to go through probably the same deck that you sent them. You can make some modifications. You can add some slides or take some out, but it will essentially be the same deck. But now you want to get through it. So you want to get through it and kind of refresh the memory about this, because not everybody in the room may have studied the deck that much. But you want to do that, you want to practice. You want to get through that in a fairly, if you've got a 45-minute meeting, you want to get through that deck in 25, 30 minutes. So that there's plenty of time for questions and discussions about your development plans, how you might fit them in. Can't tell you the number of times we'll schedule 45 minutes and at minute 47, they're still grinding through the data. And people start saying, I've got a hard stop, I'm gonna leave. And you never got to actually have the discussion that would determine whether or not they're further interested. So anything that you can do to streamline that presentation, spending 10 minutes introducing each other, trying to establish a relationship, asking if they know so-and-so, so that maybe you can form a common bond with them. All of those little tricks take time and probably don't do you that much good. Handoffs take time. CEO does this. Now for the data section, I'm going to ask our CSO to come up and talk about that. CSO says, for the biology section, our VP of biology, I mean, all of those handoffs take time. So only if you've got somebody, if your CSO is really gifted at communicating difficult concepts in an understandable way, sure, let them do that part of the presentation. But as much of it as one person can do, it's probably more streamlined and better. The other thing that people worry about is, what if they ask this? You know, I should have a slide on that. That's fine. Put it in backups. So your presentation deck can have more slides than the deck that you sent out. Wouldn't hurt to have a lot of it in backups. It's actually more impressive and effective for somebody to ask a question on that experiment. You know, what were the controls again, and how was that assay performed? Glad you asked that. I've got a backup slide that goes into more detail. Flips to it. That looks really good. Looks like you thought of the question, you had the slide prepared, it's ready, but you're not sort of pushing it on them if they didn't actually have that question. No. Do encourage them to, interrupt with questions, ask, have a discussion both during and at the end. You will convey a tremendous amount of how you're going to be worked with during that session. So they ask a question, you just argue with them. They figure this is how it's going to be. Work with you. You can answer the question and sort of correct a misunderstanding, but you also need to listen. So they may ask a question that seems to you. So I remember actually, I've been on your side. So I had a company that I started, and I thought I had this protein that had a really cool mechanism of action on the oxidative stress pathways. And I was presenting to a venture fund, and the guy said, so these, antioxidants, they're not very interesting. So I jump up and I say, it's not an antioxidant. Here's the thing, blah, 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 blah. And I realized later that was a mistake. He sort of took this long, complicated biology explanation, said antioxidant. But the reason he did that was because that's how it gets slotted sort of as you go out and present it to the world. So he knew that it gets slotted to this. And the better answer for me was to realize that that's what it gets slotted to, and then have a response to that, not just that you're misunderstanding. And that's how I've had those pitches come to me a lot, where they say, okay. And I'll sometimes, if I do take a meeting, I'll start saying, okay, you don't, I understand the chemistry here. You don't have to explain that to me. Let's get through to what you're going to do. Well, I know you say that, but I find that people actually don't understand the chemistry. So let me grind through that. And I've literally had people say that. And so in the meeting, you want to get as much dialogue as you can. You want to let them know that you listen and that you're willing to talk and go back and forth with them. At the end of the meeting, the goal is not to pull out a checkbook or a check. Not that. It's to get to the next meeting. The goal of the pitch deck is to get to the meeting. The goal of the meeting is to get to the next meeting. It's an iterative process like that. And keep that in mind. Again, know your audience. Do your homework. I'm an oncologist. How many pitches have started out trying to tell me what a bad disease pancreatic cancer is and how it's treated? They didn't do their homework. They don't know who they're meeting with. We've already covered some of this. Some stuff's better in the backup slides. Try to end your talk 15 minutes early. Listen. The other thing is, it's so tempting for entrepreneurs to want this process to move forward. So they find ways to subtly hint that you guys better get on this. So they'll say things like, yeah, we've got a couple of blue chip venture funds that are in the data room. They're really showing interest. But you know, if you guys are really interested, I could probably slow that process down. And, our response is always going to be, no, don't worry. It sounds like you're already funded. Go ahead. I mean, just don't bluff. That's the main thing. Don't bluff. It's you're there because you need capital. You're going to use it for a good purpose. You've got well-developed plans. It's perfectly reasonable that you're there. And you got to listen to them. Right, I think I'm almost out of slides. Now, I told you this one was going to be short because I found for talks on pitch decks, it's much better to sort of get through it and then have people ask questions because they've usually got pretty specific questions on pitch decks for whatever reason. So, yes.
I don't know if this is what you were trying to convey, but should small early startups be sending slide decks just cold call?
Yeah, absolutely.
Without an invitation, without a personal connection?
So we've got a portal. You will often hear that the chances of, you know, I can only speak for our fund. It'll get looked at. It'll get read. It is not going to a black hole. We've actually asked for meetings and things on that. It is fine to submit it to the portal. Now, some funds, maybe that's not true. You know, maybe it does go to a black hole. But for ours, and that's why it's so important to have the pitch deck present your best story, because it's often going to be the only chance. The other thing I'd say, and that triggers a thought, think hard about what's really confidential and what's not. So IP is confidential. If you haven't filed the IP yet, don't present things that would preclude you from filing that IP. There's almost an agreement or a negotiation process that you're under, you know, restrictions on what you can talk about. Don't say anything about that. Almost nothing else is confidential. And the more that you try and make out like, well, that's available under CDA, and you've only presented a little bit, it just makes you look naive. So most venture funds will not sign a CDA right off the bat. If they get interested, they will, but and one, we have to build a separate wing on the building to keep them all. Two, they're basically unenforceable. There's almost no way that I've had once, I think, where I really suspected a venture fund got a deck in and did something about it, based on that. But otherwise, you don't know who else to talk to. You think you're the only person who's had this idea, and this is the third deck on that they've had this month. I mean, it's just, don't worry about it. You're not giving away information. So make your best case on those decks, without worrying too much about that.
Casey, are there exceptions where people file IP, but you're in that 18-month window? Do you ever advise to not share things that might be within that window?
Well, you do anything, you always protect your IP. So I'm not interested in something that will damage your IP position, because that decreases your value. So that's a perfectly legitimate excuse. But people think that people overestimate the value of secrecy. That's why it always astonishes me to see these such and such came out of stealth mode. Well, what were they doing? So why do they need to be the stealth? The point I'm trying to make is that goes back to the don't make work. So I'll show you that if you sign a CDA, or do this, jump through this hoop or whatever. Why should I do that? That's the difference. Yes.
So, I mean, you mentioned about the your audience. I mean, we know that's important, but, people I send my deck to a pharmaceutical company, we know that, those people, they know the science, know the chemistry, know the biology, but I mean, more data. But I mean, if I send it to a VC, I mean, if I know you, I know, okay, you know biology, I can put it in the data. Initially, probably I don't know who would review it.
Yeah.
So how much data do I have to put in VC? Some way
Yeah. So you've already shown that you kind of are doing that, because you said if I send it to a pharmaceutical company, I know that people would understand the science. So you've already at least made that effort. So that's good. Now when you send it to a VC, I mean, is it a VC that invests in biotech? I mean, do they have a portfolio of biotech? If so, they'll understand. I mean, if your deck is incomprehensible, that's a problem with your deck. It's not a problem with their level of sophistication. They may not be familiar with every nuance, particularly if you're introducing a new target. So you need to have some slides and explanation of how that target ties into what is known about biology. VC funds are full of folks, PhDs, and research backgrounds. I mean, they just are. And sort of the days of the generalist fund where there's nobody in there that really understands that are over. If you're sending your deck to that kind of an investor fund, it needs to be a different deck.
It's the one thing about the order of the deck. So when you will introduce your team, because I thought you gave me the salary back and introduce your company.
Yep.
And then you present data to the team.
Yeah, so it's every deck is a story. So this gets underemphasized about how important it is to tell a story. So if in the flow of that story, introduction of the team is, so I'll give you an example. So we've got a company where the team built a company around a specific type of sort of therapy in the ophthalmology space, had a successful sale acquired by a company, found another technology in the same space it was really interesting to them. And so now they're going to develop this. So their story is this experienced team that knows this space, had success, has identified this technology as filling a need, and they think they can develop it. So up front in their deck, pretty high up, is the team, because that's a lot of their story. That this team, which has successfully done it in the past, is now going to execute it again. It's something that they know. Now I've got to justify why they believe in the technology, and so that I believe in it too, as opposed to I'm an academic founder. I've got a new and interesting target. I think I've got novel indication that will demonstrate the efficacy. Here's the steps that need to get there like that. My team comes later because it's probably not going to be fully formed anyway. So I want to tell the story of the technology first, and then you can have who you've got on the team so far. Because if they like the story, they'll help you build the team.
That's a lot. So can you help me sort of reconcile the like capital to an inflection point, which by the definition that we're talking about seems like into the clinic, this and that, where it seems like, let's just say roughly maybe 10 million buys you in clinical data or into the clinic versus kind of being an early stage company, novel, new target, all of these things where, you know, then you have these seed funds or you
Yeah.
think about that rate. So, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
so would you suggest you should be raising at least 10 to 15 to get there right off the bat?
Yeah, that's where the art comes in.
Yeah.
So at lunch, I was telling folks that one of the things we look for is it's very space dependent. So 7 years ago, whatever it was, we spun some technology out of George Sturgis lab, set up a company. We were the only institutional investors. It was immune sequencing, and a really novel way of they could sequence all your antibodies to keep heavy and light chain pair, which nobody else could do. And we sold it to one of the CAR T companies before it even sniffed the clinic. I mean, there's a bidding war right now because it filled the need. If I started that same company today, it'd be years before anybody would care. It's a different environment for that space. Right now, I mean, maybe not right now, but as certainly, you know, as of a year ago, if I had something interesting in the neurodegenerative space, I could probably sell it at preclinical stage. If that space changes, I may have to get into the clinic to show it. If I've got a drug for prostate cancer, I gotta do a phase 3 trial before anyone cares. It just differs by the indication, even within the space. So one of the things that the venture funds do, remember our customer is the acquirer. One of the things that the venture funds do is they keep track of what spaces are being acquired at what stages. And you can do that too. I mean, so if you know that you're in a space where acquisitions are occurring early, your inflection points early too. It'll just vary based on the indication of space. I don't have a template for you. It's super early. Everybody's doing that.
Pretty early.
Actually, I have one other question. I didn't really see in your outline of what you expect to see covered, kind of a competitive analysis, who the competitors are.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, I probably should have put a slide in about
And
that.
kind of what you expect to see.
Yeah. So when people talk about a competitive analysis, who's your competition? Couple of points to make, and thanks for that. I need to, I get this talking on, I've got to put some slides in there about that. Particularly in the disease space, your competition is not the disease. By that I mean, if I'm working on ALS, my competition is not another company working on ALS. It's mechanism of action. That's what they're really asking is who else is manipulating this biology in this manner, and where are they? And sometimes entrepreneurs don't understand that, and they list all the companies in the ALS space. Now, putting on my oncologist hat, somebody comes in, sits down, they've got breast cancer. I don't sit there and go, what's the one drug that can do? You know, you're going to see everything. So the other thing about the competitive landscape is if it's a hot target, you know, if it's CD47 or TIGIT, one of the new checkpoints or something like that, I don't only want to know who else is working on that, I want to know how far that, or how long they are. And what they're like, because that's what I'm trying to judge there. So if you've got a truly new and novel target that nobody else is working on, your competitive landscape slide, just nobody else is working on it. That's what this mechanism of action. You don't have to get too deep into it. But if you've got something that people are attacking from a multitude of directions, and that, maybe they don't have the exact same mechanism of action, but they're trying to do the same thing. So they use the checkpoint inhibitors and immuno-oncology, and there's all this stuff in the tumor microenvironment. You do have to acknowledge that you know that. You know, there are a lot of people trying to manipulate the tumor microenvironment. Don't have a slide there, so I'm going to turn on cold tumor on.
So on this point, so I mean, for this kind of market analysis, like, you know, if it's a new space, new target.
Yep.
Maybe for us, it's easy to understand, you know, this academic group have
Yep.
been doing this, we publish.
Yep.
But for farmer companies, they usually publish after.
Yeah, so could somebody be working on, you know? Yeah, sure.
So how can we?
Well, it's because you're not expected to know that. Now, you are expected to know things that are known, that are, you know, so don't come in and make it clear you haven't read anything. But you're not expected to know. Pharma could always have a division working on something like this. That's fine. And listen. So if one of the funds says, well, I happen to know that Pfizer's working on that too. Good. Now, you know, you can try and find out some information, but that, well, I wouldn't put it in your slide deck, but acknowledge it the next time you're talking to a fund. So there are very few things that almost nobody else is working on. And that's actually an important thing to keep in mind with your pitch deck. And when you do the meetings is which sort of gets back to this confidential thing, which is don't assume that you're the first person that knows about this. I don't know how many pitches I've seen where they think they're the only people working on this, and it's the seventh one I've seen that describing that. Your case should be able to stand on its own. Anyway.
And there are market intelligence databases that you can use to get more to that information.
There
It's
are.
not research, just research.
Yeah, that's right. So there's global data and there's things like that. Even PitchBook kind of does it. There are, and so if you know somebody that has access to that, you can do a little bit of that. They're a little wonky. I mean, they're not. Yeah, you still got to do a lot of filtering.
We
Yes,
have access to competitors now, so if you have specific competition that you need, they do a surprisingly good job of tagging keywords on the description.
they tag keywords. Yeah, then you have to filter through.
And we filter through. Most useful for trying to figure out the maturity of another company, or whether they just close a raise, or if we closed a raise 4 years ago and are likely to be running out of cash. That's where it's most useful. Who's invested in them?
Yeah.
It's really useful for that.
And I know that I'm pretty sure that all of UT system now, their tech transfer offices have global data. So you can.
Global data is very powerful. It is. If you put a search term in there, you'll get a ton of stuff.
What you do. You get this giant spreadsheet.
Yes, you get this giant
Global
spreadsheet that includes some Korean lab that, it says, but so that you'll have to do some filtering, but at least you get a sense for what you're working on.
So first I want to tell you thank you because I think it was a very interesting presentation.
Oh,
Again, then second, in this world are people who give services in there are people who can help us in preparing this really not professional.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give us such what are these?
Yeah, people that help you with your decks and that kind of stuff. So there are, I don't have any specific recommendations right now because they change over time. They get different people in.
That's the same.
I'm like, that's where you're going.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that is actually, I mean, don't make a lot of that point. That is right. That's one of the reasons you're here. So the value of those sorts of companies is in what I talked about, the storytelling, the sort of how you tell the story so that it flows. What they will not be able to do, you can't just hand them your data and say, here, make me a pitch deck. Where I found them to be most helpful is you already have a pitch deck, you give it to them and they help you refine it, not they create one for you. Because they're not going to do a very good job of that. They don't know the story.
And so just to follow up on that, your July session, even though it's going to be in person, it's going to start with a lecture about specific how to create your pitch, and then you're going to break into one-on-one hour where we're going to rip your pitch apart and then put it back together. And then from July through August, you're going to work on refining it with Sierra and Enrique, and then you're going to present it at Summit on September 15th. So.
Okay, so in my mind, the potential size of the market is important for presenting the opportunity. But I didn't come through the objective.
Yeah, I didn't put anything about the size of the market.
So the issue isn't that, I mean, it's a lot of competition in that. I mean, you got to realize that
Everything's $1 billion market.
But sometimes the market is massive. I mean, so if you get a deck, if you get a deck in the market size, it looks like it's very, very big.
That didn't help.
Yeah, but it seems like where are these guys coming from?
Yeah, because those big markets are, so oncology is the biggest one for that. But every drug in oncology is $1 billion drug. I mean, it's neurodegeneration is getting that way, except the drugs keep failing, so that's a problem. I deliberately didn't put market size in there because they've all been through, enough of the business course. So you need to have what's your total addressable market and all this stuff. So there's these obligatory slides about that. But again, for most of these diseases that we're talking about, it's not a one-shot and you're cured. It's you're going to cycle through a bunch of different things. So it's understood that the market now. There are a couple of caveats to that, but it's understood that if I've got a successful oncology drug, unless it's narrowly targeted to one thing, my market is much bigger than my initial clinical indication because it'll get used for other indications. Same thing with neurodegeneration. The pathophysiology is shared across a lot of those different diseases. So I don't need a lot of justification for the market size. The exceptions. And I may be purely going after an orphan play. I do want to know how big that is. I kind of want to know because I want to know what my clinical trial path looks like. How many patients do I have for that? If it's disease modifying and my drug's going to catch it early, I can charge a tremendous amount for it because I'll still save the healthcare system money like that. So there the market actually can play to your advantage. The market size is more important than the medtech side. Devices have to do a lot more work to show market size because they're not translatable to a wide variety of conditions. And we got burned early on in Fund 1 with a structural heart play where the market wasn't as big as we thought it was been presented to us. And that gave us religion on that. But drugs, if they've got a mechanism of action that's sort of a basic biological thing, will kind of spot you the market. Okay.
But you do have an interest, as you just said, if there is an orphan drug designation potential or rare pediatric disease, one of those things, that is of interest to you to know that that's what's.
So the orphan is interesting in that just getting orphan designation in and of itself may not be enough. So I can get an orphan. In fact, I've got a company that got an orphan designation on a rare type of sarcoma, qualifies for orphan, but it's not fatal. So if I get it approved for that indication, it's going to set my price point for a non-fatal condition And then my drug gets used for fatal conditions, I can't change that price point. So it's a two-edged sword. Where you want the orphan is when it's, you've got a disease modifying therapy that will save the healthcare system a tremendous amount of money. It's a dirty little secret, it's not so secret. The payers don't really care about quality of life. So improvements to your quality of life, they don't reimburse all that way.
How many slides till your eyes start glazing over?
That's a good question. Partially depends on how good the story is. I would say it needs to be enough to tell the story. So I would click in at probably centered around 30 or below. It doesn't need to be 12. It needs to be more detailed than that. But something like that. We do a lot of startups that are kind of academic startups, and I haven't seen as much recently, but used to in the early days, the most common thing was the professor would come in and load 70 slides, into a PowerPoint, and 50 of them were gels and blocks.
We see some of those.
Yeah, and so I would usually my response would be to say, hey, you are, I'll spot you the science, it works, now what? And then they didn't know. So it's, but yeah, I would keep it 30 or under.
So you mentioned earlier that, so the deck you sing and the deck you present will be the same. But to me, I would think the deck you sing should be more readable, maybe more text. And but the deck you present, maybe you can put some demonstration, illustration,
So that,
make it more humor,
yeah, I would be careful about that. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same. So you can have some changes, but it should, if you've sent a really good deck, then that would be the one that you sort of want to present too. I mean, to expand to, and again, you're looking for places where they got questions about that. So if you sent a really good deck, their questions are not going to be, I don't understand what you're doing. It's going to be, okay, I get what you're doing. Let's talk about, the next set of experiments or the next set of development things. Give me more of your thinking about that. There'll be details to get into in that. That's where the backup slides really helpful. And your presentation deck, you'll have a lot more backup slides.
Any other questions?
Beaten in submission.
Well, thank you, Casey.